Good Yantiv, Shana Tova Mituka. We say on Rosh Hashanah, Hayom Harat Olam. Today the world was created. What this means is that we believe that on this day, at the very beginning of time, on the first of Tishrei, billions of years ago, the divine spoke the words that created the universe. Vayehi or, let there be light. And there was light. And those words echoed through the empty universe in Hebrew, the language that we're speaking here today in River Forest, billions of years later, and praying in on this day. And even if we do not believe precisely that the Creator spoke in the Hebrew language to create the Big Bang, what we are saying is, this is how precious this language is to us. This is how sacred it is. In it is the very power of creation. What a miracle that is. About a month ago, my 2-year-old Adir came back from preschool, and he turned to my wife, Rachel, and he said to her in Hebrew, Ani ohev otach, I love you. And although I grew up in Israel, I don't always have the space to speak in Hebrew to our children. So I was surprised, and I was so grateful that Adir learned that in preschool. And I know that even as a 2-year-old, he has this very special reverence for the language. Every night we say the Shema together in the first paragraph. And he doesn't know all the words, but he pretends to know them. And he just says the Cha at the end of all the words. Me'odecha, levavcha, nafshecha, lecha hayom, with a very sweet little reverence. And in fact, he's always singing Hebrew all day and all night. And we have these books from Israel where you press a button and there's a song about the holidays or Shabbat. And he's dancing around the house all day. And we noticed then the way he was describing and talking about the synagogue, he wasn't saying synagogue, he was saying sing a God. He thought the synagogue was a place where you sing to God. Because he understands the power of this language, the language of the Torah, the language of the Bible, a sacred language, a language that has the power of Israel in it, and of our belonging to our 3,500-year-old mission, to our traditions, to our conversations with Jews across centuries and continents, the power of our very religion, of our source, of where we come from, that we use in our synagogue to sing to God. And when David Ben-Gurion, with a shaky voice, announced the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 in his heavily accented Polish Hebrew, it was a language that had been revived after 2,000 years of being kept sacred and only used for religious and ritual uses. And it was not only the moment of the fulfillment of religious dreams and of spiritual dreams, it was also being said in the newest city in the land of Israel, Tel Aviv, the center of secular Hebrew culture. And right after it was said, they said the Shechianu, the religious prayer as well. And I remember when we visited there as a congregation and revisited that moment in the Independence Museum, and they replayed the video, there wasn't a face, there wasn't one of us who did not shed tears. And the language was an essential part of that miracle. After thousands of years of preserving it for ritual and religious reasons, it was reborn in our ancient homeland through the sheer determination of a group of people. And the history is amazing. Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's usually accredited with reviving the language, though his role in many ways is largely symbolic, but still, nonetheless, he was the first in the 1880s to force his children to speak Hebrew because he wanted to create the first native Hebrew speaker in 2,000 years. And 10 years later, there were 4 families. And 10 years after that, in 1900, there were 10 families. And by 1948, 80% of all the Jews on the land used Hebrew as a language of their daily life. And there were some conflicts back then between those who did not want to use Hebrew but wanted to preserve the Yiddish. But in the end, Yiddish was the language of the exile. They were back in the land of the Torah, of Hebrew, and that's the direction they went with. And what Ben Yehuda did have to do with varying degrees of success was create words that did not exist in biblical Hebrew, right? There were only 7,000 words in the Bible. In modern Hebrew, there are now 33,000, which you still compare to English, which has 170,000 words. So it sounds like a shortcoming, but actually means that every word has a lot more shade of meaning. It's very beautiful. And those early attempts to bring back Hebrew included some people who wanted to only preserve the 7,000 biblical words. It didn't work out very well. It wasn't quite broad enough. But what Ben Yehuda did was take words from different European languages, from Arabic as well, and from Aramaic, and start mixing together all biblical words. So there were no oranges back then. So he took the word for apple, tapuach, and the word for gold, zahav, and it became tapuz, orange. And obviously there was no word for electricity in the Bible. So he found a word in the book of Ezekiel, which nobody knows, but probably meant a light-filled angel, chashmal. And so he used that for electricity. And this became the lexicon of the modern state. And now we have this wave upon wave, interesting music coming out of Israel. It's fascinating. On one side, you could have a religious Jew of Ashkenazi background singing Hasidic melodies with some Yiddish mixed into it, together with a Jew secular traditional Jew descended from Iraq, singing in the Baghdadi style. And they're singing together, mixing it all together in this mixture of rabbinic and modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, with all that harmony and the vitality of beauty of a language that was once liturgical, but then renewed with such love in modern times and with such vitality, all the vitality of a people reborn. And it was always a language that bound the dispersed Jewish people together. You could walk into a Jewish community in India, and if you spoke a few words of Hebrew from the Bible, you could speak biblical Hebrew to a few people in that synagogue. And on this day of Rosh Hashanah, whether you're in Jerusalem, or New York, or Los Angeles, or Tehran, or Mumbai, or Paris, or in River Force, according to Barb, the fifth holiest city in Judaism, there are services, and yes, our prayers are a little bit different, and our melodies are a little bit different, but in Hebrew. And this is the beauty of a sacred language, Lashon HaKodesh. And we consider Hebrew to be holy because of its source. Right? Hebrew language, we believe, was inspired from the Creator himself or herself. And we have stories in our Bible that illustrate this, how sounds that were expressed in that Hebrew language came directly from the heavens. The burning bush, Moses, the shepherd, is beckoned by God to return to Egypt and inform the Israelites that God has come to end their bondage. And Moses, anticipating their questions, turns to God and says, well, if they ask me, what is his name? What should I say? And God answers, tell them, Eheye asher Eheye sent you. I am that I am sent you. The same verb, which is also used in the ineffable name of God, Yod He Vav He, that we do not pronounce, but what's pronounced by the high priest on Yom Kippur, I am that I am. And those two names come from the verb for being. And in Kabbalah, one of the names of God is Havaya, which means pure being. So we believe that that name, I am that I am, came from that place of pure being that we call the divine, and that was communicated to Moses on that mountain. And that power is then infused into the Hebrew language. And if English is a language of Chaucer and of Shakespeare, Hebrew is the language of the Bible and of God. The language that is tied to the Jewish people and to our spiritual home. And even, it's all so interlinked together. Our communal name, Israel, Yisrael, comes after Jacob's transformation after wrestling with the angel. Right? It could be translated as struggle with God. Or Avraham, whose name means father of many, Avram. And the He in his name adds the divine breath, added after one of the stories of his spiritual transformation. And we bring such intentionality, if you think about it for a minute, about giving our children Hebrew names, and then they're called up to the Torah with their Hebrew names, and they're known as daughter or son of their parents' Hebrew names. And those ancient names are in the wedding contract, and they're on our grave. And we believe they're the names that will eventually be called on by the Holy One after we pass away. And as we read this morning in synagogue, the language is woven into the land of Israel as well. Right, in the story of the binding of Isaac, in that second where the knife is about to go down and the angel calls Avraham, Avraham, and shows him a ram in the thicket instead, which is where our religion is born and perhaps all Abrahamic faith. In that mountain, Abraham called Adonai Yireh, God will see. In Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, our spiritual capital, is taught in the Midrash to be composed of two things, Yeru and Shalayim. Yeru connected to the Shekhinah, God's presence, and Shalayim meaning peace, the city of peace and divine presence. And the Bible is all connected together, sacred language, sacred people, sacred place. And the use of the language has always been part of the holiness of our people. So in the period where we were considered, according to our religious history, to be closest to the Creator, when there was temple and prophets spoke the very word of God and walked our promised land, and the divine name was used widespreadly. And that was when the people spoke Hebrew. But then when the first temple was burned, and even when the people came back for the second temple, prophecy soon ceased, and even the use of Hebrew declined over the years. Other languages came in, Greek, Aramaic, and by the end of Second Temple times, the people did not speak Hebrew in everyday life. Aramaic was the lingua franca, the English of its day. And people lost their fluency with Hebrew. And there were translations that had to be done of the Torah into Greek and into Aramaic. And the Talmud itself is written, much of it is in Aramaic mixed in with Hebrew. And so it lay for thousands of years, a language to pray in, a language for rabbis to debate each other across the centuries. There were revivals by the poets of Spain and others. But when Hebrew was revived in those years leading to the establishment of the state of Israel, it's amazing how even the most secular of Israelis and of the Jews of the Mandate felt the miracle of speaking this ancient holy language to each other in everyday life. And even many non-observant Israelis to this day have this special reverence and awe for their language, its beauty and its power. There is a rock song by Ehud Banai, and he says, "Loud and clear the language of the Hebrew men. It is the language of the prophets, of the sign up on the wall. It is old and sacred. It will open up your soul. Speak up the language of the Hebrew men, loud and clear the language of the Hebrew men. From the deepest mass of downtown Babylon, it will take you to the next train to Mount Zion. It will get you up, it will make you fly. The language of the Hebrew men will take you high." You know, Abraham spoke the language of the Hebrew men, and also Jesus from Nazareth, and Maria Magdalene, and Einstein, and Jeremiah, and the Dylan, and the Cohen. They know something about the language of the Hebrew men. And when the Lord said, "Let there be light," it was in the language of the Hebrew men. And when Moses said, "Let my people go," it was in the language of the Hebrew men. And the early Israelis had such a love for their language, and they knew that that was the door to tide the endless waves of new immigrants that created the state. And they taught it with such painstaking devotion and love. And anyone who spent a little bit of time in Israel in a Hebrew class with an Israeli teacher know what the experience is like. And in Israel, those classes are called ulpan. And in Jerusalem, they're invariably taught by larger-than-life morot, teachers who speak with perfect diction, and they 10 generations in Israel pedigree, and speak in idioms have no longer been used since the kibbutz days, but are nonetheless beautiful. And they understand their key role as gateway to life in the promised land for Jews from across the land when they make aliyah. And our religious school teachers here at synagogue, they try and bring some of that miracle to our children. And watching our children, we see them and we know some days it's just another hurdle to learn Hebrew after their long days of school. But then there are other days where suddenly they feel the miracle of it, and it's powerful. And there are students in our religious school who requested to come specifically to our religious school because they wanted to learn better Hebrew. And the cantor and I see it, watching the tremendous effort and time that these students put in to learn this old, strange language so they can master their haftarah and their ashrei. And we appreciate how they put in not only time and energy, but also a feeling of devotion, and that they appreciate the lucidity and power of it. And that they also hope to make a second home in Israel that they can go to and travel and feel comfortable there when they go. And I remember my father telling me the story when he first got out of the plane in Israel. He was 15 years old, and he heard the man handling the luggage talking in Hebrew, and he had this powerful experience. Our powerful ancient language is being spoken by the luggage guy throwing my suitcases. And he knew he had to live there. And here was a place where the Lashon HaKodesh, right? The Lashon HaKodesh, the sacred language, was used in everyday part of life. And of course, it's also why there were those who rejected the use of Hebrew, the ultra-Orthodox, who felt that there was something that's lost when Hebrew is used for the mundane. And they still talk Yiddish amongst themselves, even today. And for others, it was the opposite. They felt that speaking the sacred language brought its power into everyday life, into everything. As the poet Amichai so effortlessly weaves into his poems, mixing together old biblical imagery with all the images of modern Israel on the other hand, and the themes of the beauty of the rabbinic tradition and all the customs of exile and then breaking free from them, the eternity of Jerusalem and just the mundane lives of the people who live there. And maybe Hebrew was a big part in ensuring the success of the state, and it was not just an experiment from a 19th century political movement. And for us, it remains a sacred language that we pray in, that we teach the next generation, another link in a long chain of the Jewish people. But in this moment in time, we are also challenged to take it further. My great-grandfather was a chazan. He was trained in Russia, and he had this very deep, beautiful voice. He loved chazanut. But it wasn't those days, it wasn't his main profession, and he did not always understand all the words, and he wasn't taught the workings of the religion. And my father tells of how at the Pesach Seder, he would Zoom, the other Zoom, through it, and just tell everybody, let's just get it done already, I'm hungry. But his sons, they all got very involved in their shuls, and then one day they said, hey, let's stop Zooming through the Seder, let's think and discuss what's going on here. And on one level, Hebrew is not just merely a sacred language to listen to. It really comes alive when you speak the words with attention and awareness and understanding, even little bits here and there. And it's truly the gateway to deepening our Judaism. And one does need that reverence for the language, but the understanding also helps, and it amplifies the sanctity. You need intention and you need understanding, right? Those are the fundamentals of prayer, what we spend so many hours doing over the holidays. When the Ari, the 16th century Kabbalist from Sfat, he created this system of prayer that was so intricate with these complex Kabbalistic permutations for every day, for every Shabbat, mathematical permutations and calculations, and only the elite could do it. And then the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, says, who cares about all of that? The highest intention is just what happens in your heart. So on one hand, it is what happens in our heart. That's what's most important. That can be in any language. If we turn to the heavens and we bare our souls in from our deepest self with sincerity, that's the highest kavana. But having some understanding of the Hebrew also carries power in it to take it another level. And now here we have this ancient language that we pray in. And our challenge is to increase our understanding, even by a modest amount. And I remember after many years of not living in Israel, I left when I was 7. When I was in my early 20s, I'd forgotten much of my Hebrew. And I cared deeply about my Judaism, and I realized that to understand my Judaism better, I had to relearn Hebrew. And that journey was not easy. It took some time. But now, stuck at home, it is a good time to learn it, step by step. We can listen to Hebrew music, or we can watch a Hebrew show. There are so many Israeli shows now, and try and listen to the sounds. There are online classes. And we're hoping to provide more Hebrew classes here at the synagogue and make that part of what we do, to bring it more into our religious school education. Not that I'm doing any publicity for anyone, but Ulpan Or has online Hebrew tutoring that is really good. You get these 20-something Israelis who are bored but charming, slowly instructing you, no nonsense, but with great heart. And that's a path to really fully tap into the power of the language, of the revival of the language, the dream of our Jewish homeland. And it's so very powerful, the mixture of culture, language, homeland. People with really no background in Judaism are drawn to it. I remember once being in Israel, studying Jewish texts, and in Jerusalem, and my roommate was making Aliyah, and he had 4 or 5 friends over for Friday night meal who were also making Aliyah. They were all Americans. And not a single one of them knew the Friday night Kiddush, not a word of it. And yet they were ready to leave their country, to enter a new country, learn a new language. Some even joined the army. There's just something about the language, about the people, the country, the atmosphere that is so powerful, and it transcends faith. You believe in it, and what you believe or don't believe. And people who do not believe in God or think anything special about Jewish faith, but yet they're still drawn to the country, to the language, to what's happening there. And of course, there is also power and intention that has gone into the language as part of keeping it holy for thousands of years. And for those of us, like us, who keep it alive in the diaspora. Going out of our way on Sundays and Wednesdays to teach our children as much as we can, to keep up that millennia-long effort. And that devotion, too, should not be thrown out or forgotten. And both religiously or through our connection to the state of Israel and its roller coaster ride. And it doesn't have to be a fluid understanding, but if you just pick up a few words here or there and then take it onward from there. As I said, listening to some Hebrew music or one of those shows, starting with 5 words and 10 words. And we're hoping to help with that at the synagogue and be part of a process. Learning how to say them, learning what they mean, putting together sentences. And it's why we appreciate the work of our preschool and religious school teachers so very much. And that is part of Avat Yisrael. That is part of the love of the Jewish people. Our way of saying, Ani ohev etchem, I love you all. And our way of saying to God, Ani ohev otcha, I love you. And bringing that power and the sweetness of our Hebrew language and creating another link at this special and incredible time, unimagined for 2,000 years, when to gain new life as being spoken in our ancient homeland. Hayom harat olam. Today the world was created with the words Vayehi Or. Let there be light. Good Yantav.